Close your eyes and imagine a castle. The image that forms is likely beautiful. Tall towers catching golden sunlight, banners rippling in clean wind, great halls where firelight dances on polished stone, where lords and ladies move in elegant procession, where life unfolds in a kind of magnificent pageant. This is the castle of imagination, of films and novels, of dreams that borrow the aesthetic of the medieval world while quietly removing everything that made it unbearable. The real castle was different. The real castle was cold. Not occasionally cold, not uncomfortably cold, but cold in ways that seeped into bone and stayed there. Cold that no fire could fully answer. Cold that was simply the condition of existence within walls designed to repel armies rather than to shelter bodies. The real castle was dark, not romantically dim, not mysteriously shadowed, but dark with a completeness that modern people never experience. Dark that swallowed torchlight and left corridors as black as buried tombs. The real castle smelled of smoke that had no chimney to escape through, of bodies that rarely bathed, of waste that accumulated in corners and moats, of food that had been preserved through processes that transformed it into something we would not recognize as nourishment. We are soft in ways we do not realize. We have been shaped by luxuries so fundamental that we have forgotten they are luxuries at all. Clean water that flows when we turn a handle. Warmth that appears when we adjust a dial. Light that banishes darkness with the flip of a switch. Food that arrives fresh and remains fresh. Medicine that actually heals. Privacy that lets us be alone when we wish to be alone. These are not natural conditions. These are achievements of centuries, technologies so successful that they have become invisible, infrastructure so reliable that we notice it only when it fails. The medieval castle had none of this. Its inhabitants lived with conditions we would find intolerable within hours, unbearable within days, impossible within a week. They endured not because they were stronger than we are, though perhaps in some ways they were, but because they had no alternative, because the castle with all its hardships was still safer than the world beyond its walls, because survival required accepting what could not be changed and finding ways to continue despite discomforts that we, from our heated rooms and illuminated screens, can barely imagine. Tonight we enter that world, not to judge it, not to feel superior to it, but to understand it, to sit with the reality that our ancestors inhabited, to honor the endurance that their lives required, to recognize that the castle walls that still stand across Europe are monuments not just to power and ambition, but to the human capacity to persist through conditions that would break us. We walk through cold corridors and dark chambers, through meals we could not eat, and nights we could not sleep through hierarchies that would crush us, and illnesses that would kill us, through a world that was not worse than ours by accident, but was simply what human life looked like before the modern age transformed everything. The fire burns low. The stone walls hold their ancient cold. The darkness waits beyond the torchlight's fragile reach. Let us enter the castle as it truly was, and discover why we would not survive what those who came before us somehow, remarkably, endured. In the gray hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, the cold of a medieval castle reached its deepest intensity. Not the cold of a winter morning that a warm coat can answer. Not the chill of an unheated room that movement can dispel, but cold that had accumulated through centuries of stone. cold that radiated from walls 3 feet thick, cold that claimed the very air and made breathing an act of discomfort. This was the cold that greeted castle inhabitants every morning of their lives, the cold that never fully lifted, even in summer, even at midday, even beside fires large enough to roast an ox. We must understand what these structures were. Castles were not built for comfort. They were not homes in any sense we would recognize. They were military installations, fortresses designed to withstand siege, to repel assault, to survive attack by enemies who would happily burn or starve their inhabitants into submission. Every architectural choice served defense. The walls were thick to resist battering rams and catapult stones. But thick walls meant that whatever temperature the stone held, it held for months. The windows were narrow, arrow slits through which defenders could shoot while presenting minimal target to attackers. But narrow windows meant that light could barely enter, and heat could not enter at all. The rooms were large and high-ceilinged to accommodate the household and its functions, but large rooms meant that heat rose uselessly toward vaulted stone, while the humans below shivered at floor level. The Great Hall was the warmest space in most castles, and the Great Hall was still miserably cold by any modern standard. A fireplace large enough to walk into could warm those who pressed close to it, could create a semicircle of tolerable temperature, extending perhaps 10 feet from the flames. Beyond that semicircle the hall returned to its natural state, cold that made fingers clumsy, cold that slowed thought, cold that turned every surface into something that drained warmth from any body that touched it. Those fortunate enough to sit near the fire enjoyed relative comfort. Those whose status placed them farther from the flames endured what they had always endured. Those who served, moving constantly between fire and far corners, experienced alternating waves of heat and cold that left the body confused, unable to regulate itself, perpetually uncomfortable. The clothing helped, but only so much. Medieval people wore layers, linen undergarments, wool tunics, outer garments of heavier wool or fur for those who could afford them. And they rarely removed these layers, sleeping in much of what they wore during the day. The wealthy had fur-lined cloaks and mantles, had gloves and hoods, had the resources to wrap themselves in materials that trapped body heat. The servants and common folk made do with rougher wool, with layers that were never quite enough, with clothing that grew damp from the body's own moisture and then grew cold, adding the misery of clammy fabric to the misery of frigid air. The beds offered some relief, but achieving that relief was itself an ordeal. The wealthy slept in massive wooden beds surrounded by curtains, not for privacy alone, but for survival. The curtains created a smaller space that body heat could warm, a microclimate within the frozen chamber where sleep became possible. The bed itself was layered with mattresses, stuffed with straw or feathers, with sheets of linen, with blankets of wool, with coverlets of fur for those of highest status. Getting into such a bed on a winter night meant climbing into cold that had accumulated through the day, meant enduring the initial shock of frozen fabric against skin, meant waiting, shivering, until body heat slowly warmed the immediate space while the rest of the chamber remained as cold as death. The servants fared worse. They slept on pallets in corridors, in kitchens near dying fires, in any space where they could find a few hours of rest between duties. Their bedding was minimal, straw that provided some insulation from stone floors, rough blankets that were never enough, proximity to others whose body heat supplemented their own. They learned to sleep despite the cold, or more accurately, they learned to survive on the fragmentary sleep that cold allowed, rising exhausted to duties that demanded energy they could barely muster. We must sit with what this meant for daily existence. The cold was not background condition that could be ignored. It was constant presence that shaped every activity, every decision, every moment of medieval castle life. Writing was difficult when fingers grew too numb to hold a quill. Eating was unpleasant when food cooled within minutes of leaving the kitchen. When the journey from hearth to hall transformed hot meals into lukewarm disappointments. Prayer was penance when kneeling on stone floors sent cold shooting through joints and spine. Even conversation was affected. People huddled close not from intimacy, but from necessity, sharing warmth while sharing words. The health effects were profound and constant. Cold suppresses the immune system. Cold makes the body vulnerable to infections that warmth might resist. Cold exacerbates every other discomfort. The hunger feels sharper. The fatigue feels heavier. The illnesses feel more severe when the body must fight cold while fighting everything else. Medieval people were sick often, and they were sick in cold that made recovery slower, that made symptoms worse, that turned minor ailments into major crises through the simple additional burden of temperature. There were strategies for coping. Hot stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth were placed in beds before sleeping, were carried in pockets during the day, were used to warm hands between tasks that required dexterity. Braziers, metal containers holding burning coals, provided portable heat that could be moved from room to room, though they also produced smoke and consumed the oxygen that made breathing comfortable. Warming rooms near kitchens, heated by the cooking fires, provided spaces where the household could gather for some relief. But all these strategies were partial, were temporary, were respites rather than solutions. The summer brought relief, but less than we might expect. Stone holds temperature with remarkable persistence. Walls that had spent all winter radiating cold continued radiating cold well into summer months. The thick walls that made castles defensible also made them slow to warm, slow to respond to the changing seasons, always lagging behind the weather by weeks or months. A castle in August might finally begin to feel comfortable, just as September approached with the first hints of returning cold. We would not survive this, not because we lack the courage of our ancestors, not because we are weaker in character, but because our bodies have been shaped by different conditions. We have lost the tolerance that develops only through constant exposure. We expect to control our environment, and when control fails, we suffer in ways that medieval people, who never expected control, did not suffer. The cold that they accepted as simply how life was would strike us as emergency, as crisis, as condition requiring immediate remedy. And in a medieval castle, there was no remedy. There was only endurance. There was only acceptance. There was only cold that never lifted, that waited in every stone, that shaped every day from painful waking to shivering sleep. The castle stands still across Europe, its walls holding memories of all the cold they have witnessed. Walk through one on a winter day and feel the chill that rises from floors and radiates from walls. Imagine spending not an hour, but a lifetime within such cold. Imagine never being warm, not truly warm, not warm in the way a heated room makes us warm, but only ever-varying degrees of cold, from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous. This was their world. This was their inheritance. And this is the first reason why we would not survive what they survived. Because the cold alone would break us before the first week ended. As the sun descends below the horizon and the last natural light drains from castle windows, a transformation begins that modern minds can barely comprehend. We live in a world that has banished darkness, that treats night as merely day with different lighting, that never truly experiences the absolute absence of light that was the nightly reality for every human being before the modern age. The medieval castle after sunset was not dim. It was not shadowy. It was dark with a completeness that changes how space itself is experienced. Dark that swallowed the great hall whole. Dark that reduced visibility to the few feet illuminated by whatever fragile flame one carried. Dark that made the familiar strange and the strange terrifying. The sources of artificial light available to castle inhabitants were pathetically inadequate by any modern standard. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were the most common, and they were terrible by every measure. They produced light measured in single watts, barely enough to read by, certainly not enough to illuminate a room. They smoked constantly, filling the air with greasy residue that coated walls and lungs alike. They smelled of burning fat, adding their particular odor to the already complex fragrance of castle life. They dripped and guttered, requiring constant attention, dying if neglected for even moments. They were expensive enough that their use was monitored, rationed, limited to essential tasks and essential people. Torches provided more light but created more problems. A torch might illuminate a corridor enough for safe passage, but it also produced smoke that accumulated in poorly ventilated spaces, that stung eyes and irritated throats, that left deposits of soot on everything it touched. Torches had to be mounted in brackets, fire hazard in structures filled with tapestries and wooden furniture, or carried by servants whose sole job was providing light for their betters. Rush lights, made from rush stalks dipped in fat, burned for 15 or 20 minutes before requiring replacement. Oil lamps, burning olive oil or other expensive fuels, provided steadier light but at cost that only the wealthy could sustain. The result was not merely inconvenience, but genuine disorientation. Spaces that were navigable by day became labyrinths by night. The great hall that seemed open and comprehensible with sunlight streaming through windows transformed into a cavern of uncertain dimensions, its far walls invisible, its corners hiding whatever imagination placed there. The spiral staircases that connected castle levels became treacherous descents where each step was act of faith, where the narrow cone of candlelight revealed only the immediate stone, while everything beyond remained unknown. The corridors that linked chambers became passages through absolute darkness, interrupted by occasional pools of torchlight, requiring travelers to cross stretches where they could not see their own hands, where walls had to be found by touch, where the next doorway was merely hoped for rather than seen. Medieval people developed skills we have lost entirely. They memorized their environments with precision that modern navigation has made unnecessary. They counted steps, registered turns, created mental maps that allowed movement through darkness that would paralyze us. They learned to read darkness, to distinguish the slightly less dark of an open doorway from the absolute dark of a solid wall, to perceive changes in air movement that indicated spaces opening or closing around them, to hear echoes that revealed the size and shape of rooms they could not see. They became creatures of darkness in ways we cannot imagine, adapted to conditions that shaped their senses and their consciousness. But they also feared the darkness, and their fear was rational. The dark concealed genuine threats. Medieval castles contained rats and mice, in numbers that modern pest control would find apocalyptic. Vermin that carried disease, that contaminated food, that could bite sleeping inhabitants. The darkness concealed other humans whose intentions might be hostile, servants with grievances, rivals with ambitions, enemies who had infiltrated the household. The darkness concealed the uneven floors and unexpected obstacles that could cause falls, could break bones, could send the unwary tumbling down staircases that were always nearby in the vertical world of castle architecture. The psychological effect was profound. Darkness encourages the mind to populate empty space with imagined threats. Medieval people, raised on stories of demons and spirits, on theology that emphasized the reality of evil, on a worldview in which the supernatural actively intervened in human affairs, experienced darkness differently than we would. The shapes that formed at the edges of candlelight were not merely optical illusions, but potentially genuine presences, the souls of the dead, the servants of Satan, the countless invisible beings that medieval cosmology believed surrounded humanity at every moment. Prayer before sleep was not merely custom, but protection, an appeal for divine defense against whatever the darkness might contain. The darkness shaped behavior in ways that structured the entire medieval day. People rose with dawn not from love of early mornings, but from practical necessity. Daylight was precious, was the only reliable illumination, was resource that could not be wasted on sleep. They retired with sunset for the same reason. Activity after dark was difficult, expensive, dangerous, reserved for essential tasks that could not wait for morning. The hours of darkness were hours of waiting, of sleep-eating or trying to sleep, of lying in beds surrounded by curtains while the castle around them disappeared into blackness, more complete than anything we ever experience. Even the wealthy, with their greater access to candles and torches and servants to tend them, did not truly defeat the darkness. They merely pushed it back slightly, created islands of light in oceans of shadow, maintained small zones of visibility, while the rest of the castle remained as dark as the countryside beyond the walls. The lord in his chamber might have light enough to read, if he could read, if he owned books, if he chose to spend candles on such activity. But the corridor outside his door was dark. The hall below was dark, the kitchen and the stable and the chapel and the guard-room, all dark, all waiting, all holding whatever they held in secrecy that only morning would reveal. We would struggle with this darkness in ways we cannot anticipate. Our eyes are no longer adapted to low light. We have been raised in illumination that has weakened the night vision our ancestors developed naturally. We have lost the mental maps that allowed navigation without sight. We rely on visual confirmation of our position at every moment. Feel lost when we cannot see our surroundings. We fear darkness in ways both primal and unfamiliar. Primal because the fear is hardwired into human consciousness. Unfamiliar because we so rarely encounter darkness complete enough to trigger that ancient fear. The first night in a medieval castle would be revelation. Lying in bed, if we were fortunate enough to have a bed, we would experience darkness as presence rather than absence, as something that pressed against us, that filled the space entirely, that reduced the world to the small zone of our own body and made everything beyond that zone into unknown territory. The sounds of the castle, the scurrying of vermin, the footsteps of guards, the settling of stone and timber, would reach us through darkness that made their sources invisible, unknowable, potentially threatening. Sleep would come slowly, if at all, and dawn would arrive as rescue, as relief, as the return of a world we could see and therefore comprehend. 7 days of such nights would exhaust us in ways that 7 days of poor sleep at home never would. The psychological weight of darkness, the constant low-grade fear it produces, the sensory deprivation it imposes. These would drain us beyond mere tiredness, would erode our mental stability, would make us understand why medieval people believed so firmly in the forces that lurked in darkness. Not because they were superstitious fools, but because darkness that complete invites belief in things that hide within it, and they lived with that darkness every night of their lives. In the courtyard of every medieval castle stood a well, stone circle descending into depths where sunlight never reached, where water accumulated from sources that no one could see or test or understand. From this well came the water that sustained the household, water for drinking, for cooking, for washing the few things that were washed, for every purpose that water serves. And from this well, too often came sickness and death, invisible poisons that no medieval understanding could identify, contamination that turned the source of life into the source of suffering. We must understand what medieval people did not understand, that the systems providing them with water were often, perhaps usually, compromised in ways that made illness inevitable. The castle well drew from groundwater that percolated through rock and soil. It drew from the same geological layers that received the seepage from latrines, from the moat that collected waste dumped from windows and garderobes, from the graves in the churchyard, from the buried refuse of the household's daily existence. The stone that separated well from cesspit was not impermeable. The distance that seemed to separate clean from unclean was often insufficient. What rose in the bucket, cold and clear and apparently pure, carried microorganisms that would cause fever, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, diseases that killed thousands and were attributed to bad air, to divine punishment, to the alignment of stars, to anything except the true source that no one could see. The moat that surrounded many castles was a particular source of contamination. It provided defensive barrier. Attackers would have to cross water under fire from the walls, but it also served as repository for waste. The garderobes projected from castle walls specifically so that their contents would fall into the moat below. Kitchen waste, stable waste, the general refuse of a household containing scores or hundreds of people, all of it found its way into water that sat stagnant through summer, that froze only partially in winter, that grew thick with accumulation that medieval people could see but could do nothing about. When water from the moat seeped into groundwater, when the same geological layers carried both to the well, the contamination was complete and invisible. The symptoms arrived without warning and without explanation. A servant would begin to feel unwell, stomach cramps, fever, the loosening of bowels that medieval medicine could not stop and often worsened with its remedies. Within days, others would show the same signs. The sickness would spread through the household, taking servants and nobles alike, demonstrating the democracy of disease that medieval hierarchy could not prevent. Some would recover, many would not, and the survivors would attribute the illness to whatever explanation their worldview provided, to punishment for sin, to corrupt air arising from the moat, to the evil influence of enemies employing witchcraft, while continuing to drink from the well that had poisoned them, because there was no alternative, because they could not see what the water contained, because survival required drinking whatever was available. The wealthy had some advantages, though not the advantages they believed they had. They could afford wine and ale, beverages that were safer than water because the processes that created them, fermentation, boiling, killed many of the organisms that water harbored. They drank water less frequently, substituting fermented drinks even for children, even at breakfast, even for purposes where we would consider alcohol inappropriate. They did not understand why wine was safer than water. They often attributed it to the superior nature of wine itself, to its warmth compared to water's coldness, to humoral theories that had nothing to do with reality. But the effect was real. Those who could afford to avoid water avoided some of the illness that water carried. The poor drank water because they had no choice. Servants whose wages could not purchase ale, peasants in surrounding villages, children too young for the fermented beverages that adults consumed. All of these drank water directly, drank the contamination it contained, suffered the consequences that fell disproportionately on those least able to afford suffering. The inequity was invisible, was unrecognized, was simply the way things were. The wealthy survived longer, partly because wealth bought alternatives to the water that killed. Washing was similarly compromised. Water used for cleaning hands or bodies or dishes carried the same contamination as water used for drinking. The concept of sanitary washing, using clean water to remove harmful substances, was meaningless when the water itself was harmful, when washing might introduce as many dangerous organisms as it removed, when the appearance of cleanliness concealed ongoing exposure to disease. Medieval people were not dirty because they were ignorant of hygiene in some abstract sense. They washed when they could. They valued cleanliness in clothing and persons. They recognized that some conditions were more pleasant than others. But their washing did not make them safer. It could not, when the water itself was the problem. The castle during siege was worse still. Normal water supplies might be cut off by attackers who understood, even without understanding bacteria, that controlling water was controlling survival. The well within the walls became the only source, and if that well was insufficient, as it often was, built for normal household use rather than for emergency supply, rationing began. Water was measured, apportioned, its use restricted to drinking and essential cooking, while washing and other purposes were eliminated. The quality of whatever water remained declined as consumption concentrated on a source never intended for such burden. Siege disease, the illness that swept through fortifications under attack, was caused partly by water that grew more dangerous as the siege continued, as desperation forced inhabitants to drink what they would have rejected under normal circumstances. We must understand what survival in a medieval castle would require of us. We would need to drink water that our bodies, accustomed to chlorinated and filtered municipal supplies, have no defenses against. We would need to accept that every drink might be the one that introduced infection, that the thirst demanding satisfaction might be satisfied at cost of fever and suffering days later. We would need to suppress the knowledge we carry, the understanding that invisible organisms can kill, because acting on that knowledge would be impossible when alternatives to contaminated water did not exist. The first days might pass without incident. We might drink from the well and feel no immediate ill effect. We might believe ourselves fortunate, might think that perhaps this particular well was pure, that our fears were exaggerated. But the incubation periods for waterborne diseases range from days to weeks. By the time symptoms appeared, we would have consumed contaminated water many times. By the time we recognized that we were sick, the cause would be impossible to avoid, the damage would be underway, and the remedies available to us, the medieval remedies that often made things worse, would be all we could access. Those who survived such illness did so through immune systems that had been challenged and strengthened from infancy, that had fought off countless minor exposures and developed defenses that we lack entirely. Their bodies knew these diseases in ways ours do not. They had suffered and survived and thereby gained protection that we, raised in sanitized environments, have never needed to develop. We would face medieval waterborne disease with medieval medical care and modern immune systems entirely unprepared for the challenge. The water that carried sickness, the well that promised life and delivered death, the invisible contamination that no one could see, and therefore no one could blame. This was the reality of hydration in the medieval castle. Survival requiring consumption of what might kill, thirst answered by danger, the most basic human need met in ways that undermined the human body, attempting to meet it. 7 days of such water would be 7 days of accumulating risk, of infection building toward crisis, of the body encountering threats it had never evolved to resist. In the castle larder, where provisions hung from hooks and rested in barrels, and accumulated against the hunger that was always potential, if not always present. The battle against decay was fought with weapons that transformed food into something we would struggle to recognize as nourishment. The medieval world without refrigeration, without canning, without the preservation technologies that make fresh food available year-round, relied on processes so intense that survival of nutrition came at cost of nearly everything else: flavor, texture, the fundamental character of what had once been animal or vegetable or grain. Salt was the primary weapon, and salt was applied with ferocity that modern palates cannot imagine. Meat preserved for winter consumption was not lightly salted, not brined, not seasoned. It was buried in salt, submerged in crystals that drew moisture from flesh, that transformed living tissue into something approaching leather, that made the resulting product stable for months or years, but also made it nearly inedible without extensive preparation. To eat such meat required days of soaking, sometimes weeks, repeated changes of water, to draw out the salt that had preserved it, and even then the texture remained altered, the taste remained salty. The experience of eating it remained an act of survival rather than pleasure. Smoking accomplished similar preservation through different transformation. Fish and meat hung in smokehouses for weeks, absorbing the compounds that would prevent bacterial growth, acquiring flavor that overwhelmed their original character, becoming something that could survive journeys and storage, but that bore little resemblance to fresh food. The intensity of smoking required for true preservation. Not the light smoking we use for flavor today, but the deep smoking that actually prevented decay, produced food that was hard, that was strongly flavored, to the point of barely being palatable, that required cooking that would soften texture and moderate taste. Drying reduced food to forms that seemed barely organic. Fish dried into planks that had to be beaten with hammers to become flexible enough for cooking. Fruits dried into leathery fragments that had to be soaked and stewed before they could be chewed. Vegetables dried into unrecognizable concentrations that added substance to pottage but contributed little that we would recognize as vegetable flavor. The drying process preserved nutrients to some degree, but it also destroyed the qualities that make food appealing. The moisture, the freshness, the life that distinguishes eating from mere fuel consumption. Bread, the staple of medieval diet, was not the fresh loaves we purchase daily. Wheat was expensive, reserved for the wealthy and for special occasions. Common bread was made from rye, from barley, from oats, from mixtures of grains that produced dense, heavy loaves with none of the lightness we expect. And these loaves were not eaten fresh. They were baked in batches, stored for weeks or months, consumed when they had hardened into objects that required soaking in ale or broth before teeth could penetrate them. The trencher, the slice of stale bread that served as plate for meals, absorbing juices from whatever was placed upon it, was often the only bread available to servants, consumed after it had served its purpose as tableware, valued more for its capacity to carry other food than for any quality of its own. The spice trade existed not for exotic flavor, but for survival. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, these were not luxuries pursued for sophisticated palates, but necessities sought to make the questionable edible. Meat that had begun to turn, fish that had aged beyond freshness, the countless provisions that existed in states between acceptable and dangerous. All of these became consumable when heavily spiced, when their true condition was concealed beneath layers of flavor that overwhelmed what lay beneath. The wealthy spent fortunes on spices, not from indulgence, but from the genuine need to make their food tolerable. And the poor, who could not afford such transformation, ate what the wealthy would reject, accepting whatever their stations and their stomachs allowed. Feast days were exceptions that proved the rule, occasions when fresh meat was slaughtered and immediately consumed, when bread was baked and immediately eaten. When the abundance of the moment created eating experiences that approached what we take for granted. The feasts depicted in medieval manuscripts, the tables groaning with food, the celebrations of plenty. These were remarkable precisely because they were rare, because they represented departure from the normal experience of scarcity and preservation, because they offered brief glimpses of what food could be when constraints of storage were temporarily removed. The rest of the time, eating was duty rather than pleasure. The body needed fuel, and fuel was provided through meals that satisfied hunger without satisfying anything else. The texture of properly preserved food was fundamentally wrong, too hard, too soft, too altered by the processes that had saved it from decay. The flavors were masked or overwhelming. The salt of preservation, the smoke of smoking, the spice of concealment, all combining into experiences that bore little relationship to the original ingredients. The portions, outside of feast days, were adequate for survival, but rarely for satisfaction. Medieval people were often hungry in ways we experience only voluntarily. their bodies adapting to chronic mild deprivation that we would find distressing. The cooking itself addressed these challenges with techniques designed for the circumstances. Long stewing softened what had hardened, extracted flavor from ingredients that had little flavor left, combined preserved meats and vegetables and grains into pottages that were nutritious, if not exciting. The castle kitchen ran nearly continuously, maintaining fires that were never allowed to die entirely, producing the slow-cooked dishes that could transform preserved ingredients into something approaching palatability. The cook was valued servant, whose skill determined whether the household ate with tolerable comfort or genuine suffering. We would struggle to eat in a medieval castle. Our palates, accustomed to fresh food and subtle flavors, would rebel against the intensity of properly preserved medieval fare. Our stomachs, adapted to regular and predictable nutrition, would struggle with the irregular availability and questionable quality that characterized castle provisions. Our psychology, shaped by abundance and choice, would resist the acceptance required to consume what survival demanded. The first meal might be manageable. Novelty can carry us past initial resistance. By the third day, eating would become burden. By the end of the week, we would understand viscerally what hunger meant to those who lived with it constantly, who ate what was available because the alternative was not eating at all. The food that time transformed, the provisions that preserved life at cost of pleasure. The endless battle against decay fought with weapons that altered everything they touched. This was medieval nutrition, the fuel that kept bodies functioning through conditions that challenged every other aspect of survival, the meals that sustained without satisfying, the eating that was necessity, stripped of nearly everything that makes eating human. In the thickness of the castle wall, projecting outward over moat or ground, a small stone chamber offered what passed for sanitation in the medieval world. This was the garderobe, literally wardrobe, named perhaps for the clothes stored there whose fabric absorbed smoke and smell that served to protect against moths, or perhaps named simply to avoid speaking directly about bodily functions that medieval people, like us, preferred to address obliquely. The chamber contained a wooden seat with a hole, and beneath that hole was either open air or a chute leading to a cesspit below. This was the medieval toilet, and its experience would shock us in ways that reveal how much we take for granted. The garderobe was cold. It projected from the castle wall, surrounded on three sides by air, exposed to whatever weather prevailed outside. In winter, using the garderobe meant exposing vulnerable flesh to air that might be below freezing, meant sitting on stone or wood that radiated cold, meant enduring temperatures that made the necessary visit as brief as possible. In summer, the garderobe retained less cold, but acquired new disadvantages. The smell that rose from the moat below, the flies that discovered the source of waste, the heat that made the small chamber stifling. There was no good season for the garderobe. There was only variation in the type of discomfort it inflicted. The draft was constant. The opening that allowed waste to fall also allowed air to rise, creating airflow that made the garderobe windy as well as cold. Sitting above the void meant sitting in current that carried both chill and odor, that made the experience impossible to ignore, that added sensory assault to physical exposure. The wind through the garderobe was noted in medieval sources, was joked about, complained about, accepted as simply part of what using such facilities meant. The privacy was minimal to non-existent. Garderobes were sometimes arranged in rows, multiple seats separated by nothing but air, used simultaneously by household members who conducted their business in company that we would find unbearable. The concept of bathroom privacy, the closed door, the individual space, the isolation we consider essential, did not exist in the same form. Medieval people were less concerned with bodily functions observed than we are, partly from necessity, partly from a worldview that placed different emphasis on different aspects of human existence. But their acceptance would not be our acceptance. We would find the public nature of medieval sanitation profoundly uncomfortable, would struggle with exposure that they took for granted. The alternatives to the garderobe were no better and often worse. Chamber pots served those who could not or would not venture to the garderobe. The ill, the elderly, the noble who preferred not to leave their chambers. These pots had to be emptied, typically by servants who carried them through corridors and downstairs to disposal points. The disposal was often simply a window, with a cry of warning to those below. Gardez l'eau, beware the water, perhaps the origin of the word loo. The waste splashed into streets or courtyards or moats, accumulating, decomposing, adding to the general level of contamination that medieval environments could never escape. The smell pervaded everything. Castle moats were not the clear water of imagination, but were thick with accumulated waste, were breeding grounds for bacteria and insects, were sources of odor that rose on warm days to fill every space above them. The cesspits beneath garderobes were emptied rarely, if ever, were simply holes that received waste until they could receive no more, were left to decompose through processes that produced gases both foul and dangerous. Castle servants, called gong farmers, were tasked with emptying cesspits when absolutely necessary. A job so unpleasant, so hazardous, so despised, that it was assigned to the lowest and most desperate, who sometimes died from the fumes they encountered in confined spaces. The health consequences were severe and constant. Human waste carries diseases: typhoid, cholera, dysentery, parasites, that spread when sanitation fails. Medieval sanitation failed constantly by design because there was no design that could succeed with available technology. The waste that fell into moats contaminated water that seeped into wells. The waste that accumulated in cesspits attracted vermin that spread disease through the household. The waste that splashed into streets was walked through, was tracked into buildings, was source of contamination that no amount of careful behavior could entirely avoid. Intestinal parasites were nearly universal. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites shows populations heavily infected with roundworms, whipworms, and other parasites that compete for nutrition, that weaken the body, that contribute to the general burden of chronic ill health that medieval people carried. These parasites spread through the fecal-oral route, through contamination of food and water by waste, through the basic sanitary failures that castle infrastructure guaranteed. Medieval people lived with their parasites, were weakened by them, rarely knew they carried them because such burden was simply normal, was what everyone experienced, was invisible background to lives already challenged by countless other difficulties. We could not adapt to these conditions quickly enough to survive them. Our bodies, raised in environments where sanitation separates waste from water and food, have no tolerance for the contamination that medieval people encountered constantly. Our psychology, shaped by privacy and cleanliness that we treat as fundamental, would rebel against exposure and conditions that they accepted. The garderobe alone, cold, drafty, public, foul, would distress us beyond what mere description can convey. The general sanitary failure of castle life would sicken us within days, would introduce infections and parasites that our systems have never needed to resist. The garderobe and the chamber pot, the stone seat over the void, the smell that never lifted, and the waste that never truly went away. This was medieval sanitation, the infrastructure of bodily function designed by necessity rather than by understanding, maintained through practices that spread more disease than they prevented, endured by people who had no alternative and therefore no grounds for complaint that could lead to improvement. 7 days of such conditions would teach us what comfort truly means, would make us grateful for systems we have never considered, would show us how much of modern life depends on the simple achievement of keeping waste separate from everything else. The great hall fills for the evening meal, and in the arrangement of bodies, the allocation of seats, the sequence of service, the entire social structure of medieval life becomes visible. The Lord sits at the high table, raised on a platform facing the hall, positioned to see everyone while everyone sees him. Beside him sits his lady, perhaps visiting nobility, the castle's most honored guests. At tables running perpendicular from the high table, the household arranges itself in precise order of status. Higher servants closer to the Lord, lower servants farther away, each position reflecting a hierarchy that everyone understood and no one could violate without consequence. We must understand that this was not merely custom. This was moral order. Medieval society believed that God had arranged humanity into ranks, those who prayed, those who fought, those who worked, and that departing from one's assigned position was not merely ambitious, but sinful. The servant who sat above his station, the peasant who presumed to equality with his betters, the child who challenged parental authority, all of these violated divine arrangement, upset the cosmic order that held society together, committed offenses that deserved punishment, both earthly and eternal. A modern person transported to a medieval castle would violate this hierarchy constantly without knowing it. We would speak when we should remain silent, would stand when we should kneel, would sit when we should stand, would address our betters without proper forms, would fail to yield passage in corridors, would make eye contact when eyes should be lowered, would assume equality that medieval society never offered, and would punish severely when assumed. Our entire manner of being, casual, direct, presumptively equal, would mark us as dangerous, as disruptive, as requiring correction or removal. The hierarchy determined everything. It determined what one ate. The Lord received fresh meat while servants received stale bread. The Lord drank wine while servants drank water or weak ale. It determined where one slept, the Lord in his chamber while servants slept in corridors and kitchens. It determined what one wore. Sumptuary laws specified which fabrics which ranks could wear, which colors, which styles. It determined whether one could speak in certain spaces, whether one could enter certain rooms, whether one could sit or must stand, whether one would receive acknowledgement or would be treated as invisible. Every moment of every day reinforced the hierarchy, reminded each person of their place, demonstrated that place was fixed, and departure from it would not be tolerated. For those at the bottom, the hierarchy meant constant subordination. Servants woke when commanded, worked when commanded, ate what was provided when it was provided, slept where they were assigned. They could be beaten for errors, for slowness, for insolence, perceived or actual. They had legal status barely above property, could be dismissed without recourse, could be punished without appeal, existed at the mercy of those above them in the hierarchy who might be merciful or might not, depending on temperament and circumstance. The life of a castle servant was not slavery in the legal sense, but it was not freedom in any sense we would recognize. For those in the middle, the hierarchy meant constant navigation. The steward who managed the household had authority over other servants, but remained subordinate to the lord and his family. The knight who held position of honor owed deference to greater nobles and to the lord he served. Every relationship was calibrated by status. Every interaction carried risk of giving offense through insufficient deference, or of losing status through excessive deference. The competition for position was intense and constant, conducted through subtle signals that an outsider could not read and would violate unknowingly. For those at the top, the hierarchy meant constant maintenance. The lord who seemed to command freely was himself bound by obligations, to his own lord, to the church, to the customs that his position required him to uphold. He had to appear powerful while managing resources that were always inadequate. He had to reward service without depleting the wealth that made his position possible. He had to enforce hierarchy upon those below him while submitting to hierarchy from those above. The top of the castle hierarchy was not freedom but responsibility, not power unlimited, but power constrained by the very system that granted it. We would find this suffocating. We have been raised in societies that proclaim equality as value, that encourage aspiration regardless of birth, that treat hierarchy as problem to be solved rather than order to be maintained. Even those of us who understand that equality remains incomplete, that birth still confers advantage, that hierarchies still operate, even we believe in the possibility of movement, in the rightness of effort to improve one's station, in the illegitimacy of fixed positions that cannot be changed. Medieval society believed the opposite, believed that hierarchy was divine, that movement was sin, that one's place was assigned by God and should be accepted with gratitude, regardless of how difficult that place might be. 1 week in such a system would reveal what freedom actually requires. Not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of options, the possibility of change, the belief that tomorrow might differ from today. Medieval servants believed their grandchildren would be servants. Medieval peasants believed their descendants would be peasants. Medieval nobility believed that birth conferred right that no achievement could equal and no failure could forfeit. The closure of this system, the absolute fixing of possibility, the denial of aspiration itself, this would crush spirits accustomed to even the illusion of mobility. We would not survive the hierarchy because we could not accept it, could not bow deeply enough, kneel long enough, silent ourselves completely enough to satisfy superiors whose authority we would not genuinely recognize. Our resistance would show. Our insolence would be perceived even when we attempted compliance. Our fundamental belief that we are the equals of anyone, however often that belief is violated in practice, would mark us as dangerous, as requiring discipline, as problems to be solved through the methods medieval society employed for solving such problems: violence, exile, death, if necessary. The hierarchy that held you in place, the order that seemed natural to those within it and seems oppressive to those without. The castle was not merely building, but was social machine, organizing humans into ranks, enforcing those ranks through every detail of daily life, maintaining structure without which medieval society believed chaos would follow. 7 days of such enforcement would show us what structure truly costs, would make us grateful for the loosening that modernity has achieved, would teach us that the hierarchy we still navigate is gentle compared to the hierarchy that once held humanity in place as firmly as the stones held the castle walls. The castle armory holds swords and maces, pikes and crossbows, the instruments of violence organized and maintained and ready for use that might come at any moment. We must understand that the medieval castle was not merely fortified home, but was military installation. Built because violence was expected, maintained because peace was temporary, populated by people who were trained for fighting and prepared to fight. At all times, violence was not exception in medieval life, but was constant presence, constant possibility, constant shaper of behavior and expectation. The weapons visible in the armory were matched by weapons carried on persons throughout the castle. Men of any status above servant carried knives at minimum. Not eating implements alone, though they served that purpose, but actual weapons that might be drawn if circumstances required. Knights and men-at-arms carried swords as markers of status and as tools of profession. Even women of noble birth learned to use daggers for self-defense. The castle population was armed population, and armed populations behave differently than disarmed ones, more carefully in some ways, more dangerously in others, always with awareness that escalation from argument to combat was matter of moments. Discipline in the castle was enforced through violence that we would consider abuse. Servants who failed in their duties, who showed disrespect, who made errors in their work. Any of these might be beaten, might be struck with hands or rods or whatever instrument was convenient. Children were beaten routinely as part of education. Medieval pedagogy explicitly advocated physical punishment as essential to forming proper character. Apprentices were beaten by masters. Squires were beaten by knights. Anyone of lower status was subject to physical correction by anyone of higher status who found their behavior wanting. The violence was not secret, not shameful, not hidden. It was public, was expected, was considered appropriate response to violations of order. Tournament and training provided outlets for violence that was nevertheless genuinely dangerous. Knights who practiced their skills used real weapons, suffered real injuries, sometimes died from wounds received in what was theoretically preparation for actual combat. Tournaments, though regulated, killed participants regularly. The role of noble dead from tournament injuries suggests entertainment that we would consider blood sport, accepted because the skills being practiced were essential, because the men practicing them were expected to use those skills in actual war, because death in tournament was death with honor. Justice within the castle was administered violently. Theft might be punished by removal of hand. Serious offenses might warrant blinding, castration, death by methods that maximized suffering. The castle dungeon, if the castle had one, held prisoners awaiting trial or punishment, held them in conditions designed to break will, to extract confession, to demonstrate the power of the Lord whose justice they had offended. Torture was legal, was normal, was accepted method of investigation when other methods failed. The screams from the dungeon were audible to those above, were reminders of what awaited those who violated the Lord's peace. Conflict between individuals followed patterns that legitimized violence in ways we no longer accept. Insults to honor demanded response, demanded combat, demanded blood, demanded satisfaction that could only be achieved through physical confrontation. Trial by combat settled disputes between those of appropriate status. God would grant victory to the party in the right, and therefore combat was not mere violence, but was Divin's judgment. The stronger party was not merely more powerful, but was, by definition, more righteous, because God would not allow the wrong to triumph. This logic seems absurd to us, but made perfect sense within a worldview that believed God actively intervened in human affairs and would not permit injustice to stand. Warfare was the ultimate expression of castle violence, and warfare was frequent. The castle existed to resist siege, and sieges came with regularity that punctuated medieval life with episodes of intense danger. During siege, the violence intensified beyond anything peacetime contained. The arrows and stones that fell from attacking forces, the sorties that defenders mounted against besiegers, the starvation that both sides imposed upon each other as strategy. If the castle fell, the violence became catastrophic. Massacres of garrisons that had resisted too long, rape and pillage that were considered legitimate rewards for the victorious army, destruction that left nothing standing. We would find this violence impossible to navigate. Our instincts, shaped by societies that have monopolized legitimate violence in the state, that have removed weapons from daily carry, that have made physical confrontation between individuals relatively rare. Our instincts would fail us constantly. We would not know when threat was serious and when it was posture. We would not know how to respond to challenges that required violent response. We would not know how to submit appropriately when submission was required, or resist appropriately when resistance was expected. Our confusion would make us dangerous, unpredictable, unreliable, potentially threatening simply through our failure to follow codes we could not perceive. The violence that waited in shadows, the weapons that were always present, the discipline enforced through pain, the conflict resolved through blood, the warfare that could begin at any moment and once begun followed no rules we would recognize. 7 days in such environment would leave us traumatized by what we witnessed, endangered by what we failed to understand, grateful beyond measure for the relative peace that modern societies have achieved at such cost and maintain with such difficulty. In the chamber where the sick lay dying, remedies were administered that would horrify modern medicine. The physician, if one was available, had studied texts inherited from antiquity, Greek theories filtered through Arabic translations, Roman practices modified by medieval editions that had almost nothing to do with how human bodies actually worked. The treatments that followed from this learning were not merely ineffective, but were often actively harmful, hastening death rather than preventing it, adding suffering to suffering without providing comfort or cure. The theory of humors dominated medieval medicine. the body was believed to contain four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, whose balance determined health. Illness meant imbalance, and treatment meant restoring balance through interventions that seem to us like torture. Bleeding to reduce excess blood, purging to expel excess bile, inducing vomiting or sweating or urination to remove whatever humor was supposedly in excess. A patient already weakened by disease would be further weakened by treatments that drained fluids, that stressed systems already failing, that pushed the body toward collapse while claiming to restore equilibrium. Bloodletting was particularly common and particularly destructive. The physician would open a vein, in the arm, sometimes elsewhere depending on the condition being treated, and allow blood to flow into a bowl until the supposed excess had been removed. Patients who needed strength to fight infection were drained of the blood that carried that strength. Patients who needed hydration were depleted of fluid. Patients who needed rest were subjected to procedures that exhausted them further. The practice continued for centuries, killing countless patients, including George Washington, whose doctors bled him of over half his blood in his final illness. Medications were equally problematic. Mercury was administered for numerous conditions, particularly syphilis, with effects we now recognize as mercury poisoning, layered upon whatever original condition was being treated. Arsenic appeared in remedies. Powdered gems were prescribed on the theory that precious substances must have precious effects. Herbs that had genuine medicinal properties were mixed with herbs that had none, administered in doses that ranged from ineffective to toxic, prepared according to protocols that had nothing to do with extracting useful compounds. Surgery was butchery. Without anesthesia, beyond alcohol consumed before procedures or physical restraint during them, patients endured cutting fully conscious of every sensation. Without antiseptic, infections followed almost every operation, so that surviving the surgery often meant dying of what came after. Without understanding of anatomy beyond what could be learned from occasional dissection of criminals, surgeons cut without full knowledge of what their knives would encounter. Amputation was common because it was often the only option. Infected limbs had to be removed before infection spread. The patient was held down, the saw applied, the screaming endured by everyone involved. Those who survived did so through constitutions strong enough to withstand shock and to fight the infection that almost invariably followed. Infectious disease swept through populations without any accurate understanding of how it spread. Plague took millions. The medieval response, flight for those who could afford it, prayer for those who could not, did nothing to prevent transmission and often accelerated it as fleeing citizens carried infection to new locations. The flagellants, who whipped themselves in procession, believing that self-inflicted suffering would appease divine anger, simply gathered crowds where disease could spread more efficiently. The Jews who were massacred on suspicion of poisoning wells were innocent scapegoats for a phenomenon no one understood. Mental illness was treated as spiritual condition, as possession, as divine punishment, as manifestation of moral failing. The mentally ill were confined, were exorcised, were beaten in attempts to drive out the demons supposedly causing their behavior. There was no concept of psychiatric treatment, no understanding that the brain could be diseased like other organs. The suffering of the mentally ill, invisible in ways that physical illness was visible, was addressed through methods that added trauma to whatever underlying condition existed. We would find illness in a medieval castle terrifying in ways that go beyond the illness itself. We would know that the treatments offered were wrong, that the bleeding would weaken rather than strengthen, that the mercury would poison rather than heal. We would watch remedies administered that we knew would cause harm, and we would be powerless to prevent them. Our knowledge dismissed as ignorance, our objections as interference, our modern understanding incomprehensible to those operating from frameworks that seemed to them equally valid. We would face illness knowing that survival depended on our bodies alone, that the medical system existed to make things worse, that every intervention was gamble in which the house always won, the illness without remedy, the treatments worse than the disease, the death that came despite everything, despite prayers, despite bleeding, despite the most expensive physicians and the most devoted care. Medieval people died of conditions we survive routinely. They died young, died often, died watching their children die before them and knowing they had no power to prevent it. 7 days of illness in such conditions would strip away any illusion that we could survive what they survived, would show us that the medical advances we take for granted are the difference between life and death, not metaphorically, but literally, not abstractly, but in the bodies of those we would watch, suffer, and be unable to help. The rain falls for the 5th consecutive day. The castle walls seem to press inward. The activities available for entertainment have been exhausted. The same songs sung too many times, the same stories told until surprise is impossible, the same chess positions played until outcomes are predictable. Time moves with terrible slowness through hours that nothing can fill, through days that blend into each other, through weeks and months and seasons that offer variation without true relief. This is the boredom of medieval castle life, and its weight would crush spirits accustomed to the endless novelty of the modern world. We must understand what was absent. Books were rare, expensive to produce, available in numbers that a single modern library would dwarf. Most castle inhabitants could not read anyway. Literacy was specialized skill possessed by clergy and some nobility, not general capacity available to all. The books that did exist were in Latin, in manuscript forms difficult to read even for the literate, treating subjects, theology, philosophy, ancient history, that required education most did not possess. The casual reading that fills modern leisure hours did not exist for medieval people. The escape into fictional worlds that books provide was not available. Music provided some entertainment, but not music as we experience it. There were no recordings. Music existed only in live performance, only when someone was willing and able to perform it. The castle might have musicians whose job was providing such performance, but even they had limited repertoires, repeated the same melodies and songs, could not produce the endless variety that modern access to recorded music offers. Silence filled most hours. When music came, it was event, was novelty, was relief from quiet that was otherwise unbroken, except by the sounds of work and weather. Games occupied some time: chess, backgammon, dice, games of strategy and chance that passed hours without deeply engaging minds accustomed to more stimulation. Cards would come later. Medieval Europe had not yet received them. The games that existed were finite. their possibilities exhaustible, their interest limited for those who played them repeatedly over years and decades. Gambling added stakes, but not variety. The same games with consequences attached. The same outcomes with wealth or reputation riding on them. Physical activities helped when weather permitted. Hunting was entertainment for the nobility, combining sport with practical food acquisition, offering exercise and excitement, and escape from castle walls. But hunting required suitable weather, required game available, required horses and hounds and equipment that limited participation to those of appropriate status. When weather confined the household indoors, and weather in Northern Europe confined households indoors for months at a time, hunting was impossible, and the walls that protected became walls that imprisoned. Needlework occupied noble women for hours, for days, for years on single projects. The tapestries that decorated castle walls were not merely aesthetic choices, but were monuments to time killed, hours converted into thread and pattern. Boredom transformed into beauty through labor that provided structure without excitement. Spinning and weaving occupied women of lower status, provided necessary goods while filling time that might otherwise hang empty. The work was repetitive, was endless, was the textile equivalent of the clock whose hands move too slowly to observe but whose passage is nonetheless real. Conversation was entertainment, was information exchange, was social bonding, but conversation too has limits. The same people sharing the same castle repeated the same observations, the same gossip, the same opinions, until novelty was impossible, until everyone knew what everyone else thought about everything, until speaking became mere exercise of voice rather than genuine communication. The isolation of castle life meant isolation from new ideas, new perspectives, new topics that might refresh conversations grown stale through repetition. Religious observance filled time with structure, if not excitement. The hours of prayer, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, punctuated the day with ritual that required participation, that demanded presence in the chapel, that provided rhythm without providing stimulation. The prayers were the same each day, the same each week, varying only with the liturgical calendar that brought occasional feast days to interrupt the routine of ordinary time. We would find this boredom unbearable. Our minds, trained by constant stimulation, by the endless feeds and streams and updates of modern media, by entertainment available at every moment through devices we carry everywhere, our minds would rebel against hours empty of novelty. We would feel the absence of distraction as physical discomfort, would pace and fidget and seek anything to interrupt the monotony, would discover that our tolerance for empty time has atrophied through disuse, until we cannot tolerate what medieval people simply accepted as the texture of existence. The boredom that stretched like years, the hours that would not pass, the entertainment that was never enough. 7 days of such emptiness would reveal how dependent we have become on stimulation, how adapted to novelty, how helpless in its absence. We would survive the cold and the dark and the bad food more easily than we would survive the endless, crushing, inescapable boredom of a life without distraction. The candle gutters and fails. The darkness that follows is absolute, not the darkness of a room with distant streetlight, Not the darkness of night with moon and stars visible through windows, but darkness that presses against open eyes and returns nothing. Darkness that makes visible and invisible identical. In this darkness, the castle speaks. Sounds emerge that the day concealed, that the light made ignorable, that now fill the consciousness with presences unseen and therefore unlimited by what sight might reveal. The rats move first. They have waited for darkness, for the cessation of human activity that makes movement dangerous. Now they emerge from walls and corners, from the spaces behind stored food and beneath floorboards, and they move with sounds that cannot be precisely located. Scratching that might be near or far, scurrying that stops and starts unpredictably. The occasional squeak of communication between creatures conducting their nightly business. The castle hosts hundreds, perhaps thousands of rats. They share human space because human space provides food, the grain stores, the kitchen waste, the provisions that preservation cannot fully protect. Their sounds are the sounds of a parallel population, active when humans rest, claiming the castle as their own during hours of darkness. Other vermin join the chorus. Mice, smaller and more numerous than rats, produce lighter sounds, but more of them. Insects, fleas, lice, bed bugs move silently, but their presence is felt as irritation, as itching that interrupts sleep, as the awareness that one's body is hosting creatures that feed on blood and excrete in fabric. The darkness that conceals them does not conceal their effects. Sleep interrupted by scratching at bites, by crawling sensations, by the knowledge that unseen creatures are upon you. The animals kept for use add their sound. Dogs in the hall might bark at disturbances, real or imagined. Horses in stables might stamp and blow, their sounds carrying through stone and timber to sleeping chambers above. Livestock kept for warmth. Chickens, sometimes goats or pigs in smaller establishments, create the sounds of animals settling, shifting, responding to stimuli humans cannot perceive. The castle is not merely human space, but is shared space, and the sharing becomes audible in darkness. Other humans make noise that privacy would prevent if privacy existed. Snoring from nearby sleepers, and nearby might mean in the same bed, in the same room, or merely in the same corridor, penetrates whatever barriers exist. Coughing from the ill, crying from children, the sounds of bodily functions conducted without the plumbing that modern spaces provide. Sex, in a world where couples shared beds but beds shared rooms with servants and children, was not silent but was audible to those sharing space, was simply part of the night sounds that everyone pretended not to notice. The castle itself speaks. Stone and timber respond to temperature changes, contracting as night cold deepens, producing groans and creaks that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Wind finds gaps in masonry, creates whistling and moaning that imagination can interpret as voices, as presences, as the spirits that medieval people believed inhabited their world. Rain on stone, snow on shutters, the thousand sounds of weather attacking walls, all audible, all adding to the chorus of the night. Guards patrol. Their footsteps echo through corridors. Their calls mark the hours. Their presence is both reassurance and reminder. Reassurance that the castle is watched. Reminder that watching is necessary. That danger is real enough to warrant vigilance through all the hours of darkness. The changing of the guard brings activity, voices, movement. the sounds of routine that interrupt sleep for those housed near guard posts. Sleep in these conditions was not the deep, uninterrupted rest we consider normal. It was fragmentary, periods of unconsciousness interrupted by sounds that demanded at least partial waking, by noises that had to be identified as harmless before sleep could resume, by the constant low-level alertness that living creatures maintain when environment is not fully secure. Medieval sleep patterns differed from ours. People often slept in two phases, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness between them. This pattern may have developed partly from the impossibility of sleeping continuously through environments that never stopped demanding attention. We would not sleep. Not truly, not restfully, not in the way that allows body and mind to recover from the day's demands. We would lie in darkness, hearing sounds we could not identify, fearing sounds we could identify, startling at noises that our companions seemed to ignore, never quite relaxing into the unconsciousness that sleep requires. By morning we would be exhausted, not merely tired but depleted, drained by hours of vigilance that felt like anything but rest. 7 nights of such non-sleep would break us. The accumulating fatigue would cloud thought, would slow reaction, would make the other challenges of castle life, the cold, the hierarchy, the violence, even harder to navigate. We would become versions of ourselves we barely recognized, reduced by sleeplessness to something barely functional. We would understand that sleep is not luxury, but necessity, and that the conditions for sleep that we take for granted are conditions that must be created, maintained, protected with technology and infrastructure that the medieval world entirely lacked. Before dawn, when darkness still holds the castle in its grip, a bell sounds. Not emergency, not alarm, but summons, the call to matins, the first of the day's 8 canonical hours, the prayer required of the faithful before light returns to the sky. Bodies rise from warmth into cold, shuffle toward the chapel, assemble in darkness broken only by candles before the altar. The prayers begin. Latin phrases repeated from memory, the same words said yesterday and the day before, and every day stretching back through centuries. The day begins with God, and God will be present at every moment that follows. We must understand that medieval religion was not optional, was not private preference, was not one aspect of life among many. It was total. It penetrated every hour of every day through required observances, the 8 canonical hours, the frequent fast days that prohibited meat or reduced food intake entirely, the confession required at intervals, the Mass that demanded attendance, the prayers that accompanied every activity from waking to sleeping. One could not opt out. One could not choose to skip observance and face merely social disapproval. To neglect religious duty was to commit sin, to endanger one's immortal soul, to risk damnation that was not metaphor but was the literal fate awaiting those who died outside grace. The doctrine that surrounded these observances left no room for doubt. The Church taught, and medieval society believed with absolute conviction, that heaven and hell were real places, that souls went to one or the other based on conduct and faith, that the suffering of hell was eternal, was fire, that burned without consuming, was agony beyond description, lasting forever. This was not opinion. This was not interpretation. This was known truth, as certain as anything could be certain, as real as the stone walls of the castle, as pressing as the hunger that came before meals. To doubt was itself sin. To question was already to fall away from the faith required for salvation. For modern minds accustomed to religious diversity, to secular spaces, to the possibility of non-belief, this totality would be suffocating. We are used to separation between religious and other aspects of life, to domains where faith does not speak, to hours and activities that are simply secular. Medieval castle life offered no such separation. The very stones of the building had been blessed. The food was prayed over before and after consumption. The work was offered to God. The sleep was bookended by prayers. Every moment was moment before the divine gaze. Every action was action for which eternal consequences followed. The presence of sin was equally constant. Medieval theology identified sins in places we would not see them. In pride, certainly, but also in the pleasure of food, in the enjoyment of comfort, in the normal desires of human bodies and minds. The examining of conscience required for confession meant scrutinizing every thought, every impulse, every moment of pleasure for the sin it might contain. Nothing was innocent. Nothing was simply good. Everything was potentially occasion for sin that would require confession, penance, the painful process of acknowledging before a priest the ways one had failed to meet standards that could never be fully met. For those who believed, and everyone officially believed, because alternatives were not available, this constant divine presence provided genuine comfort. God was watching, but watching meant protecting. God was judging, but judging meant ultimate justice. God was demanding, but demanding meant caring. The faith that terrified also consoled. The same theology that threatened hell promised heaven. The same system that identified sin offered forgiveness. Medieval people found in their religion not only burden, but also relief, not only fear, but also hope, not only constraint, but also meaning that made constraint bearable. We would struggle to inhabit this worldview even temporarily. Our minds have been shaped by assumptions incompatible with medieval faith, assumptions about personal autonomy, about the limits of religious authority, about the legitimacy of doubt, about the separation of spheres that medieval thought rejected entirely. We could mimic the motions. We could attend the prayers, mouth the words, kneel and rise and cross ourselves in imitation of those around us. But we could not believe as they believed, and they would sense our disbelief, would perceive in us something wrong, something missing, something dangerous. The consequences for incomplete faith could be severe. Heresy, belief that departed from church teaching, was crime punished by death. Failure to participate adequately in required observances drew suspicion that might lead to investigation, that might lead to accusation, that might lead to the flames that awaited those whose faith was found wanting. We would navigate this landscape of religious requirement while hiding a fundamental incapacity to meet its demands, while concealing a doubt that would mark us as threats if discovered. The God who watched every moment, the faith that admitted no alternative, the sin that lurked in every thought and action, the judgment that awaited every soul. This was the spiritual environment of medieval castle life, demanding, total, inescapable, providing both burden and comfort to those who believed, providing only burden to those who could not. 7 days of such religion would reveal what it means to live in a world where the sacred dominates, where the secular does not exist, where every moment is moment before the eternal, and where the soul's fate hangs in balance that tips with every thought. As darkness falls on the final evening, the great gate swings closed. The drawbridge rises. The portcullis descends. The castle seals itself for the night, and in that sealing we find the final truth that explains everything else, explains the cold that was preferred to vulnerability, the hierarchy that provided order against chaos, the hardships that were accepted because alternatives were worse. The castle was not home. The castle was fortress, and fortress exists because outside the walls, in the world that the gate holds at bay, waited threats that made every internal suffering seem small by comparison. We have grown accustomed to safety in ways we cannot perceive until safety is removed. We lock our doors at night, but we do not fear armies. We worry about crime, but we do not worry about siege. We live within systems of protection so effective and so invisible that we have forgotten they exist. Police who patrol, courts that adjudicate, laws that govern, armies that secure borders, the entire apparatus of modern state that makes violence rare and predictable instead of constant and arbitrary. Medieval people had none of this. They had walls. They had gates. They had the strength of stone and the vigilance of guards, and the prayers that God would protect where human effort failed. The threats were real and immediate. Warfare was constant in medieval Europe, not distant conflict reported in news, but armies that might appear on the horizon with days or hours of warning, that might besiege the castle for months, that might breach the walls and do things to the inhabitants that the chroniclers described with horrified detail. Rape, murder, mutilation, enslavement, all awaited those whose castles fell, whose gates failed, whose walls proved insufficient against the force brought against them. The hardships within the walls were the price paid to avoid the horrors outside. The brigands and outlaws who populated the countryside between castles made travel dangerous even in peacetime. The forests that covered much of medieval Europe harbored men who had no place in settled society, who survived through robbery and violence, who would kill for a warm cloak and leave the body for wolves. The protection that modern law enforcement provides simply did not exist. Once outside castle walls, one was on one's own, dependent on armed escort, or personal prowess, or simple luck to reach the next protected space. Disease moved through populations without understanding or control. Plague could empty cities, could reduce kingdoms, could make the living envy the dead. When plague came, castle gates closed not against armies, but against infection, and those within waited to see whether the sickness had entered with them before the closing, whether they would survive or join the countless dead who had no remedy and no hope. Famine struck when harvests failed, and harvests failed with regularity that made food security impossible to achieve. The preservation that transformed food into barely edible forms existed because fresh food could not be guaranteed, because the hunger of winter and spring was real possibility every year, because the castle's stores represented the difference between survival and starvation when crops did not come in. We would understand in the closing of the gate why everything else was acceptable, why the cold was endured, because warmth outside the walls meant vulnerability, why the hierarchy was maintained, because order within prevented the chaos without, why the food was eaten, because hunger was the alternative, why the hardships were borne, because the world that waited beyond the gate was harder still. The castle was bargain, was exchange, was the terms humanity accepted in order to survive conditions we have forgotten because we have transcended them. The walls that confined also protected. The hierarchy that oppressed also organized. The religion that demanded also comforted. Everything within the castle existed in relation to everything without. The suffering inside measured against the suffering that would follow if the outside broke through. We would not survive 7 days because we have lost the understanding that made such survival possible. We no longer know what the castle protected against. We no longer feel the threats that made hardship acceptable. We no longer carry in our bones the knowledge that medieval people carried, that safety is precious, that it must be purchased, that its price is suffering that seems unbearable until compared with the alternative. The gate closes, the castle is sealed. The night begins, with all its cold and darkness and discomfort. But within the walls, the household continues, eating their preserved food, sleeping their interrupted sleep, praying their required prayers, living their constrained lives. They will rise tomorrow and do it again. They will do it for their entire lives, and their children will do it, and their grandchildren, because this is how humanity survived the centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern state, between the old order's collapse and the new order's establishment, the gate that held the world at bay, the walls that made survival possible, the castle that was not home but was shelter, not comfort but was safety, not freedom but was the best that could be achieved in a world where freedom meant vulnerability and comfort meant death. 7 days within those walls would teach us what our ancestors knew, and we have forgotten: that everything has cost, that safety requires sacrifice, that the lives we live are built upon achievements we never see and foundations we never acknowledge. Sleep now. The castle stands as it has stood for centuries, its stones holding memory of all who sheltered within, who suffered within, who survived within, when survival was the most that could be hoped for. Dream of the gate closing as night falls, of the torches lit against darkness, of the fire that cannot warm the hall, of the hierarchy that cannot be escaped, of the faith that cannot be questioned, of all the hardships that were simply life for those who came before. And wake grateful. Wake in your warm room with its electric light, its running water, its fresh food waiting in the refrigerator, its privacy and its freedom, and its 1,000 comforts that are not comforts at all, but are miracles, are achievements, are the inheritance of centuries of effort to make human life something more than bare survival. The castle endures, but we do not have to endure within it. We have escaped what our ancestors could not escape. We have been given what they could not have imagined. We have received the gift of a world where the castle's hardships are history rather than present, where the gate is open, where the walls have fallen, where the threats that made such suffering necessary have been, not eliminated, but tamed, controlled, reduced to manageable proportions. This is what you would not survive. This is why a week would break you. Not because you are weak, but because you are blessed, blessed to live in an age that has achieved what medieval people could only pray for, blessed to experience comfort they never knew existed, blessed to take for granted what they would have considered heaven itself. The fire dims, the castle ceases, and across the centuries, The spirits of those who survived what we could not survive keep their silent watch, honored by our remembrance, justified by our gratitude, connected to us through the long chain of human endurance that brought us from their world to ours. Good night. Rest well. The castle is behind you now. The morning will come, and with it all the gifts of the present age. But remember sometimes what it cost to arrive here. Remember those who paid that cost. Remember the cold and the dark, and the hunger and the fear. And let that memory make the warmth of your bed, the light at your fingertips, the food in your kitchen, the safety of your world seem as miraculous as they truly are. The gate is closed, the world is held at bay, and in the safety of the present, we honor the past by understanding what it was, and by being grateful, endlessly grateful, that we do not have to survive it.